Matthew 6:19, Jesus says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Well, please do keep that open, and then inside your sheets is an outline of where we're going. If you suffer from joint pain, swelling, and stiffness, I'm afraid you've probably got rheumatism. But what are the symptoms of materialism? There are online quizzes to help with diagnosis. A materialistic person places a high value on money and possessions. So questions like, do you envy people who have cooler stuff than you or a higher income? Do you feel you'd be happier if only you had more money? Do you seek comfort in retail therapy, buying stuff you don't really need? Does buying expensive stuff make you feel good about yourself? Do you always feel you need to have the newest version of everything? Do you think a lot about money? Do you dream of owning a bigger house or a better car? Are you impressed by people who have a luxury lifestyle? Do you measure success and worth? Do you measure it based on how much people earn and what they own? How much do you give away? If our symptoms suggest we suffer from materialism, we have a big problem. Because according to Jesus, we cannot be materialistic and follow him. We have to choose. That is the hard-hitting message of this next bit of the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus called his followers at the end of chapter 4, and then he put on this discipleship seminar for them in chapters 5 to 7, up on a mountain, teaching them some of the basics. And he started in chapter 5 with some foundational attitudes or beatitudes of the disciple. He followed that up by the importance of living a righteous life. He then taught we needed to live for the Father. We looked at this last week, the audience of one, not living to please others and get praise from them. And now he zeroes in on money and possessions. How must a disciple of Jesus relate to money, relate to stuff? That's what Jesus is teaching on here in the second half of chapter 6. And it's very countercultural and it's very challenging, but it's also inspiring. Because Jesus doesn't just give us diagnosis, he gives us treatment as well. He shows us a better way to live. He shows us how to be free from the slavery that materialism is. We were going to look at 19 to 34, but there's so much in this, we're going to look at it over 2 weeks. We'll just look today at 19 to 24. And you'll see in the outline there, Jesus makes 3 points. Firstly, don't lay up treasure on earth, because it won't last. So verse 19, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Treasures just means money, it means stuff, material stuff. And Jesus is saying we're not to store it up here on earth, accumulating more and more, piling up savings and investments, gadgets and goods, living in luxury. We're not to do that. That is what the rich fool did in Luke chapter 12. His business took off, he had these amazing plans for expansion, he had it all. He said, eat, drink and be merry. And Jesus described him as someone who lays up treasure for himself. It's what the rich people were doing in James chapter 5 verse 3, where it says, you have laid up treasure in the last days, you have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. So that's what we shouldn't do. Why shouldn't we do it? Well, because it's short-sighted. It's not a good investment. So here in chapter 6, verse 19, it says that here on earth, moth and rust destroy, and thieves break in and steal. So designer clothes, they get eaten by moths, or they just wear out. Fancy cars, they rust, they break down. If you've got nice gear, people nick it. The market crashes, your investments go over a cliff. We're going to watch a video a bit later in which a Jewish man called Joseph shares his testimony of how he came to faith in Christ. And he was a very successful banker. He became a multimillionaire. He says, I had a yacht in the south of France, a Rolls Royce, a huge house. I felt on top of the world. The press called me Midas. And I was full of ego. And I was full of myself. I was my own God. I didn't take any interest at all in the one true God. But the time came when the stock market crashed and I lost everything. And I went from one extreme to the other and started taking Valium and drinking whiskey. Okay, so treasures laid up on earth, so uncertain. 1 Timothy 6:17 tells us not to set our hopes on the uncertainty of riches. And that's the point, they are uncertain. And when we die, of course, we can't take any of this stuff with us. We lose it all. That's what the rich fool discovered. He had all this wealth, he had all these future plans, and then God said to him, you fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you've prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself. So money, possessions, they promise security, but they can't deliver in this world of decay and evil and death. And that is why Jesus talks about the deceitfulness of wealth, the deceitfulness of riches in Mark 4, in the parable of the soils. Because they whisper to us, I can give you security. But they're lying. They're deceitful. So Jesus urges us not to lay up treasures on earth. Instead, he says, verse 20, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. So Jesus says treasures in heaven are 100% secure. It's a much better investment. Treasures in heaven are out of reach of the moths, the rust, the thieves, and death. So we don't lose these treasures when we die. That is when we get to enjoy them. They're lasting, they're eternal. So no wonder Jesus calls this treasure in heaven, he calls it true riches in Luke 16. But what does it mean to have or not have treasure in heaven? Treasures in heaven is a picture of the salvation blessings that God promises his people in the age to come. We had this back in chapter 5 in the Beatitudes, that Jesus said to his disciples in 5:12, he said, your reward is great in heaven. And this reward that's great in heaven was what each Beatitude ended with. It's what it promised, that his followers will belong to the kingdom of heaven, that they will be comforted, that they'll inherit the earth, that they'll be satisfied, that they'll receive mercy, that they'll see God, they'll be called sons of God. So all of this is the great reward. These are true riches. These are the treasures in heaven. So as disciples, how do we lay up treasures in heaven? Well, Jesus is saying, by doing good with our money, by giving our money away, by sharing what we have, rather than just spending it on ourselves. So as Jesus said to the rich young ruler in Matthew 19, he said, sell what you possess, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Or as Paul says to the rich in 1 Timothy 6, he says, do good, be rich in good works, be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future. So those passages are saying that as disciples, we store up treasures in heaven by giving, by being generous. Now remember, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, so this isn't saying that being generous buys us a place in heaven. As we heard at the beginning of the service, it's only through God's amazing grace to us in Christ, his overflowing generosity, that we belong to the kingdom. So we're relying, aren't we, on the one sent to save us from our sins. But the Sermon on the Mount is saying if we follow Christ, we will live kingdom lives. And this bit is saying that will affect what we do with our money. We'll lay up treasures in heaven, not on earth. Through giving, through generosity, through sharing, through doing good with our money, not just spending it on ourselves. John Wesley, the 18th century church leader, one day he bought some pictures for his room. And one of the chambermaids came in, and it was a cold day, and she was just wearing this really thin gown. And so he reached into his pocket to give her some money to buy a coat, but he found he didn't have enough money left to do that. And immediately the thought struck him that the Lord was not pleased with how he'd spent his money. And he said to himself, "You've adorned your walls with the money, which might have screened this poor creature from the cold." And what he resolved that day was that going forward, he was going to live more simply so that he could help other people in need. And he basically worked out that he could live pretty comfortably on £28 a year. This was back in the 18th century. And he would give away the rest to help other people in need. And that is what he did from that moment on, from 1731 until his death 60 years later. But here's the key thing. His income grew, his annual income grew from £30 a year to £1,400 a year, because he became very successful. But he resolved he would continue to live on £28 a year, and he would give the rest away. And that is what he did. And his motto was basically this. His motto was, gain all you can, save all you can, by which he meant live simply, give all you can. And that's pretty challenging, isn't it? Because many people do the reverse. So as their income increases, they keep giving the same away, but they just spend more on themselves. Now, we need to be careful here so we don't misunderstand what the Bible is teaching on this. Let me give 3 caveats. Firstly, you can lay up treasures in heaven and still have personal possessions or a house. So in Romans 16:5, the church in Rome met in the house of a couple called Prisca and Aquila. Second, you can lay up treasures in heaven and still save for the future. Proverbs 6:6 tells us to learn from the ant about saving up for the future. And third, you can lay up treasures in heaven and still enjoy God's good gifts. So 1 Timothy 6 says that God richly provides us with everything to enjoy. God has made us with physical bodies in a material world to enjoy. So the material, the physical, money, stuff, they're not evil things. What is evil, the Bible is saying, is greed. It's selfishness. So living in poverty is not something we are to aspire to and to seek. But the Bible does say a big no to materialism. And it says a big yes to generosity and sacrificial giving and sharing and simpler lifestyle. For verse 21, Jesus goes on, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Our Father in heaven wants our hearts to be for him and for eternity. But our hearts won't be for him, our hearts won't be for eternity, if we're laying up treasures on earth. Because Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So he's basically teaching that our heart follows our money. What we spend our money on will determine where our heart is. So if you invest most of your money in some huge, great house in the countryside, or a luxury sports car, or collecting fine art, or the stock market, that is where your heart will be, because Jesus is saying our heart follows our money. That's what we'll be thinking about. That's what we'll be worried about. That's what we'll be passionate about. That's what we'll be constantly checking up on. But if you invest lots of money in the work of the gospel and helping the poor, that's where your heart will be. One church pastor commented that he said sometimes people say to him, I want more of a heart for missions. And his reply is, Jesus tells you how to get it. Put your money in missions, your heart will be in missions. And so the question is, where are we laying up treasures for ourselves, on earth or in heaven? And Jesus is saying we can't do both of those things. We've got to choose. If we lay up treasures on earth, we won't have treasures in heaven. But if we lay up treasures in heaven, there's a big encouragement here. Because we may feel, look, I'm giving really generously, although the people don't know about that because we looked at that last week, we're keeping it secret. I'm living more simply, and we're thinking, is it worth it? You know, other people around me, they're just living their best life now. And Jesus is saying, yeah, it is worth it. You are a spiritual Warren Buffett. Okay, you are the best investor, is what Jesus is saying. The film Schindler's List tells the story of this guy, Oskar Schindler, and he used his wealth as a businessman to rescue Jews from a concentration camp. And as you see in the film, but at the end of the film there's a really powerful scene where he's surrounded by Jews he's rescued. And they're so grateful for what he's done. But Oskar is weeping as he thinks of how many other people he could have saved. If he'd sold stuff that he'd owned and he'd used that money. He takes off, he's got some luxury watch, and he takes this off and he thinks, well, you know, that watch, that could have saved 10 Jews. And he's got this fancy car, and he thinks, well, the money from saving that could have saved 100, or I can't remember what the figures were. And I wonder if we may at all feel the same at the end of our lives, looking back on the good we could have done with our money. All that money that I spent on those luxuries that I didn't really need, and what good is it now? And it could have been used to help others, to save others. It could have been invested in eternity. Now, God doesn't want us to live a life of constant guilt over every purchase we make. But it is a reminder, isn't it, that money is a gift, not just to provide for our own needs, but for doing good, for funding gospel work, for helping those in need. Secondly, he says, don't be greedy because it will shape your whole life. So verse 22, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Okay, physically this is true. The eye is the lamp of the body. That means it sort of lets in light. And if you close your eyes, what happens? Your body goes dark. And if you're blind, you know, your body's full of darkness. We think, well, okay, so what? Why is Jesus talking about eyes and bodies? Why the change of subject? It's not a change of subject. He's still on the money. Because in the Bible, to have a good or a healthy eye is an expression, and it means to be generous. So Proverbs 22:9 says, whoever has a good eye will be blessed, for he shares his bread with the poor. So to have a good eye means to be generous, to be giving. It's an expression. And by contrast, to have a bad eye or unhealthy eye is an expression in the Bible which means you are greedy, you are stingy. So Proverbs 23 verse 6, do not eat the bread of a man whose eye is evil, or who is stingy. Don't desire his delicacies, for he's like one who is inwardly calculating how much you're eating and so on. Or Proverbs 28:22, a man whose eye is evil, or a stingy man, one translation has it, hastens after wealth. So what is Jesus saying? He is saying that our attitude to money will affect our whole life. The eye is the lamp of the body. So he's saying if you are generous, if you have a good eye, your whole body will be full of light. But if you are greedy and stingy, if you have a bad eye, your whole body will be full of darkness. So what he's saying is that what we do with our money will affect our whole life. for good or for bad. So for good or for bad, it will shape us as people. It will affect us spiritually. It's all connected. And so our lives are not divided into these sort of watertight compartments, as if I've got my spiritual life and my relationship with God here. And I've got my character there, and I've got my money and stuff over here. Jesus is saying, no, our attitude to money and stuff, it shapes absolutely everything in life. It's the lamp of the body. It will either fill our lives with light or with darkness. And so far from being a sort of little side issue, money and stuff, Jesus is saying, is one of the biggest factors in our lives. It is hugely important to discipleship. As followers of Christ, he's saying we are to have a good eye. That is, we are to be generous. We're not to lay up treasures for ourselves here on earth. We are to be giving. We are to be sharing. And if we are, he's saying, then our whole body will be full of light. That is to say, this generosity will shape us as people. It will make us more Christ-like. It will affect everything about us. Our character, our values, our happiness, our peace. That's a wonderful incentive to do that. But he's warning, if we have a bad eye, if we are greedy, if we are stingy with money, if we are laying up treasures for ourselves on earth, he's saying it will fill our lives with darkness. We'll become bitter and envious and discontent and anxious, self-centered people who are shriveled up and turned inwards on ourselves. As Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 6, we had it in our first reading, he said this, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, and into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. So that is the darkness Jesus is warning about, which will fill our lives. Having a bad eye, so being greedy, it keeps some people from starting to follow Christ in the first place. Remember the rich young ruler in Matthew 19? He went away sad. Having a bad eye, being greedy, it leads others to stop being fruitful. So Mark 4:19, do you remember the seed is choked by the deceitfulness of wealth. And thirdly, it leads some to fall away from Christ. So 1 Timothy 6:10 continues about the love of money. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pangs. The eye is the lamp of the body, has a huge impact. I wonder if we see money and stuff as being that dangerous. Imagine we have a big Barge reunion in 20 years' time. Sadly, some who are currently professing faith in Christ won't be there because they will have fallen away. What is the most likely cause of that, do you think? So what would be your sort of top 3 spiritual dangers? Sexual immorality, having an affair, work taking over life, love of money. I think it would be Jesus' number 1 warning. The New Testament pictures the Christian life as a race. I wonder how the race is going for you at the moment. So would you say, well, I'm running well, but I want to run even faster? Or would you say, well, I'm at a puff and I'm slowing down? Or would you say, well, I've stopped? Our attitude to money and stuff, it impacts our running massively in the Christian life. It's very, very hard to run well when you're holding big bags of money and you're weighed down with luxury goods. If we want to keep going, if we want to run well, if we want to go faster, Jesus is saying we need to lighten the load. And so thirdly, last point, don't try to serve God and money because it ain't possible. So verse 24. No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. No one can serve 2 masters. Really? I mean, loads of people have 2 bosses. I mean, portfolio careers becoming increasingly common. You know, having more than one job at the same time. And if you do that, you may well have more than one boss that you're serving. But in the ancient world, you could only have 1 master. So in the ancient world, if you were a slave, if you were a servant, you served one master. Your master bought you, your master owned you, and you served them exclusively. So slavery involves single ownership, full-time service. And so Jesus says at the end of verse 24, you cannot serve God and money. So God and money are two different masters, and Jesus is saying you can't serve both, you've got to choose. You've got to choose. The word translated money here, you'll see in the little footnote, is mammon. And that name mammon, it makes it sound like a god with a name, like the Old Testament gods, remember Baal, Asher and so on. Mammon sounds like that. And that is the point, you see, that is the point. That money, materialism, or love of money, it's a rival god battling for our hearts and souls. And of course, this is the majority religion in our society. So the shopping malls are like the cathedrals, the catalogues are the Bibles, the advertisers like the prophets calling people to bow down and worship and lay up treasures for ourselves on earth. And Jesus is saying we need to choose whom we will serve, God or mammon. It is possible to love money and to be religious. That's what the Pharisees did. So in Luke 16, Jesus says they were lovers of money. So it's possible to love money and be religious, but it's not possible to love money and love God. It's not possible to serve money and serve God. Jesus says we have to choose. God's Old Testament people, they thought, didn't they, that they could serve the Lord and serve the gods of the nations at the same time. But the Lord wouldn't have it. So Joshua challenged the people, Joshua 24, he said this, put away the gods that your fathers served in Egypt and serve the Lord. Choose this day whom you will serve. And he said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And Jesus is saying we face the same stark choice. Choose this day whom you will serve, whether it's God or money. Keir Starmer said recently, didn't he, that Europe is a crossroads in history and must act now. And Jesus also brings us to this sort of crossroads in our own lives, and standing there he says we have to choose which way we're going to go. One day Jesus met a rich young man and he brought him to this crossroads and he forced him to choose. He said to him, look, sell what you possess, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. Which way did he go? When the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. For this rich young man, the cost of following Jesus was too great. So faced with his choice of Jesus or money, he chose money. He preferred treasures on earth to treasures in heaven. What would we have done in his situation? What have we done? What will we do now? But on another day, Jesus met another rich young man. And this guy received Jesus into his house, and he stood up and said, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. Faced with a choice, he chose Jesus, and he chose treasure in heaven. And Jesus said, today, salvation has come to this house. Notice that in both cases, the choice involved big changes in what they did with their money and their stuff. It wasn't just about a change of heart. It wasn't just about a change of attitude. It really affected what they did with their money and the stuff. And so in each of these three little sections we looked at today, Jesus has put before us these two alternatives. Treasure on earth, treasure in heaven. Greed or generosity. Serving money, serving God. He's saying you can't have both, you've got to choose. The Jewish banker I mentioned earlier, he'd been laying up treasures on earth. He had no thought of heaven at all. But when he lost it all, the bottom fell out of his world. And one day he wandered into a Bible study in someone's home, and there and then, that very day, he received Jesus as his Messiah. He started a new life. And sometimes, you see, sometimes God does take away our treasures on earth to bring us to our senses, that we might have treasure in heaven. That's what he did with the prodigal son. But what if he doesn't? What if he doesn't take this stuff away? Well, then I guess it's up to us. That we need to weigh up which is the best investment. Who is the best master? Not just for now, but for eternity. So choose this day whom we will serve. Let's take a moment to pause and reflect on that, and maybe to pray in the quietness of our own hearts and minds, and then we'll join in prayer together.